delivered by Dr. Rafi, who is a political economist. He holds a PhD from University College London and has written a very interesting book called Patriarchal Hierarchy, Market Capitalism and Production in Afghanistan that appeared in 2022. His last position was at Durham University. So with this lecture, we decided to do something a little bit different, and that is to have a discussant. And the discussant is Lutfi Brahimi, who is a non-resident research fellow at the initiative. We think that a discussant is a good idea, we hope, that it provides a perspective on the subject and it stimulates debates. Lutfi has a PhD in economics from the University of Exeter and is co-author of a fascinating study, Surviving the Crisis. Hi, our speaker is on. I have introduced you. I really apologize for our screw up because we did not take into account daylight saving time.
No problem about that.
In Bishkek,
I apologize.
We don't. Well, you don't apologize. We told you we screwed up by 1 hour. In Bishkek, we don't have daylight saving time. Okay, please start your lecture. I've already introduced you. So I just want to say that the lecture will be some 40 minutes, and then with comments by Lutfi, and raise your hand if you want to speak, and then or make a comment in the chat section. Please.
Great, thanks, Balan, for the introduction. Again, I apologize for the confusion. So I'm just sharing my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the point of today's lecture is a research that I've been conducting after my PhD finished in 2021, which was part of a book project, and then out of that, the concern regarding Afghanistan's state building project during 2001 to 2021, I started this other research on the state design in Afghanistan, especially looking into political economy issues and a contradiction that was built into the state design, owing principally to economic management. So this research has already been published at the Global Policy Journal. If you wish to read it further, please feel free to look for it. And I'm glad for Afghanistan Research Initiative and Bodan for the research grant that was given me during conducting the final stages of this research project and right before publication. So to start with some contextual theoretical context to how state building has been approached, especially after the end of the Cold War and the early 1990s. And this concern regarding nation building has emerged ever since, because the concept of failed states or state building has become more and more prominent ever since. And if you put yourself in the context of the early 1990s, you have this environment of triumphalism especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a push towards reform of state-run economies towards a market economy, in which the World Bank played quite a central role, right? In this environment in this thought environment, this thinking environment, a post-war moment was considered more or less as a clean slate institutional environment, right? So it was seen as a moment which was ripe for the kind of radical reforms that otherwise the World Bank and international financial institutions were following in non-conflict affected countries. There you had to deal with the host government and sort of push the reforms through bureaucratic hurdles and negotiation. Here in post-war moments, you didn't have that government, right? So the government was being built anew. And there was this thinking that you had a perfect moment to implement the kind of pro-market and new liberal reforms that he had in mind in these kinds of contexts. It was sort of a more radical version of what you normally saw in non-conflict affected environments, right? So as Christopher Kramer puts it, this was sort of a reconstruction was a form of revolution from the above. In this case, the above was the host government in conjunction with the World Bank and other international financial institutions. So World Bank didn't have a policy guideline to engage more and more in post-conflict reconstruction. That was remedied in 1998. The organization came up with a post-conflict framework. And the thinking, the institutional thinking regarding creating the right set of institutions, right, for markets to take hold, had become quite central by the late 1990s. There was a rapid reform in the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Union countries, especially in Eastern Europe, which did not lead to an optimal outcome. And there was this growing thinking that you require the right set of institutions before you can implement market reforms, right? And in order to contribute intellectually towards a better way of understanding that kind of institution, what kind of institutions would be conducive to market economy, there was this emerging school called New Institutionalist Economics that emerged, had emerged in the early 1930s, but became more conceptualized in the 1970s. But by the 1990s, it had become quite consolidated and important, so much so that one prominent thinker from the school won the Nobel Prize in 1993, Douglas North. So they were quite influential in framing the debate regarding institutions, especially in the development discourse of the World Bank and international financial institutions. What it meant was basically you reform institutions, so formal and informal institutions, norms and behaviors and traditions, towards being conducive to accepting market reforms. Right? So, and a post-war moment was seen as the right environment in order to sort of make use of this quite golden opportunity to push for this for a radical version of that kind of an institutional reform. Right? That way or that approach was obviously against intervention by the state and resource allocation. So in the environment of the mid-1990s, the push was to get rid of state intervention in the economy, not invite it back. But there was a push to get rid of state intervention and resource allocation, but at the same time, by the late 1990s, there was this understanding, this realization that we need to bring back the state, but in order to create the environment for market-led resource allocation, not for the state to directly intervene in resource allocation. So the institutionalist contribution by the new institutionalist thinkers was to explain what kind of institutions the state would need to bring about to enable the environment for market-led reforms. Right? World Bank came up with this typology of state functions. By 1997, there was this thinking that states that are fragile, they have less capacity, should begin with minimal functions and move on to intermediate functions and on to activist functions. This would mean mostly that there is no mention of resource allocation. By this time, the World Bank is more vocal in terms of pushing back any kind of notion of intervention in resource allocation by the state. And the scope of, most importantly, what I wish you to take from this slide is that the scope of World Bank's intervention and development is drastically expanded by this time, right? So World Bank was mainly engaged in project implementation after World War II. That was the purpose of creating World Bank. So it was called the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, right? It was mainly focused on physical infrastructure, etc. But by late 1990s, the scope of its intervention gets drastically expanded, and a lot of what is normally considered political functions in a state were included under the concept of economic management. So economic management was part of World Bank's mandate. And when that concept was enlarged, then the World Bank was allowed to get involved in a lot of the domains that were normally considered political, and the World Bank was not supposed to engage in them, right? So state functions were defined, and the World Bank saw itself a sort of a larger mandate to get involved in target countries. As I mentioned before, normally the World Bank would engage in infrastructure rebuilding, but now the scope increased or expanded into economic policy, administrative policy, infrastructure, and social policy. So this was a sort of a much more holistic mandate that the World Bank was given, especially based on the framework that it published in 1998. It called it an integrated package of assistance, right? So going back to the new institutionalist thinking, this is sort of the policy angle to it. The World Bank steps in as the leading the central international financial institution to spearhead target countries, especially post-war countries, towards a towards stability, towards development, by implementing these set of reforms with the help of the World Bank. So if we go back to the early 2002, so late 2001, early 2002, right about the time when the state building project began in Afghanistan, the US-led intervention began in Afghanistan in response to the Al-Qaeda attacks in New York. So the political economy logic of state building as a product of what I just described, implemented in Afghanistan, looked more or less like this. This is a schematic representation of sort of the approach that was taken. You create a centralized state. You centralize state power through negotiation or coercion, which is tasked to provide public services, but at the same time, it is tasked to create the right institutional environment for markets to take hold, right? So it is meant to implement a host of reforms, not only change laws and regulations and enforce them effectively, but also in many ways transform society's norms and mores and way of thinking through pushing a spirit of entrepreneurialism, through sort of infusing this commercial ethos in society so that it becomes conducive for markets, right? It is a huge and monumental task to accomplish. And it requires a lot of time, and in history we have seen that creating that kind of that set of institutions takes decades, if not centuries, to successfully create, right? So to successfully accomplish. So the post-war state in Afghanistan was meant to summarize: centralize power, provide public services, and create the right institutional environment for markets to take hold, right? And there were outcomes that were expected from that to come about, which would then feed back into the centralization process of state power. The economic environment was meant to create the right amount of private sector activities, which would then provide the right amount of tax revenue, which would then feed back into the fiscal policy of the central state. But one question that comes to mind is, who pays for this process? So while the state is trying to create its independent fiscal revenue, some other revenue source has to provide for this process in practice, right? What the research mainly tries to say is that this process of generating state revenue through market-based taxes, it contains a contradiction. The state during this process comes to depend on an external source. So what I've called this configuration is a deferred revenue regime. So during a deferred revenue regime, in the sense of making the state's revenue dependent on conditions that are not in place. So these conditions from condition 1 from objective 1 to objective 3 are not in place. They have to be implemented. During this process, the state's revenue is deferred to a point where you have adequate taxes, right? So it's a deferred revenue regime. During this process, the state has to depend on an external source, and that external source usually, especially in Afghanistan's case, was official development assistance, aid in normal parlance. So, and aid is normally administered through external agencies. So I will explain. In Afghanistan, there are a host of agencies that came into play in order to administer aid, which are not part of the centralization process of state power. Right? So you create a parallel bureaucracy in order to run the fiscal aspect of the state while expecting the state to accomplish those three tasks that were part of its design. Right? That contradiction comes to undermine the state design itself, because you have these parallel agencies that come to erode the credibility of the state. The state does not see the need to negotiate with societies to strike a bargain regarding fiscal policy. There are different aspects, different ways that configuration comes to undermine the state building project. In terms of methodology, I would invite you to go into the paper and read more in detail, but roughly this is what I've followed. I've basically tried to explain how the policymaking process from late 2001, so from late 2001 all the way to mid 2010s, when the last five-year final year policy was formulated, the ANPDF. The line of policy was basically to push for this the creation of an enabling environment for private sector activities to take hold, right? And the point is to show that this line of policy at the same time and in a parallel process created dependence on development assistance, on ODA, and a parallel bureaucracy which came to erode the state building process. So this basically puts into perspective this graph what I mean by a deferred revenue regime in the paper, right? So in Afghanistan, quite early on, from 2002, 2003, all the way up to 2020, the core state budget became highly dependent on grants and loans from external sources. Right? Independent revenue from domestic sources continued to even decrease, not increase. There was a gap between the state core budget from independent sources and the total expenditure needs of the state, of the government. This does not include development expenditure, development budget, which was a much larger budgetary fund, which was mainly administered through NGOs, through international organizations, through bilateral agencies. This is just to sort of show in a nutshell what only in terms of the core budget of the state, the consequences of the state building design was. So in terms of the fiscal policy of the state, you had this growing gap between independent revenue and what the state required to run its activities. And in order to fill this gap, you had dependency on official development assistance. Afghanistan received quite a lot of assistance during the period of Western-led state building process from 2001 to 2021. around $82 billion in terms of ODA. So ODA is the money that a country, an external country, directly pays through its sources. It does not include charities or payments to military assistance. It's only development assistance from country A to country B. And in those regards, you have around $82 billion that were given to Afghanistan between 2001 to 2021. And there were many unilateral funds that were run by countries. In this case, for instance, the slide shows the fund by the United States, so Relief, Reconstruction, and Civilian Operations Fund. This was sort of a unilateral fund appropriated by the US government and granted to Afghanistan. Spent either mostly off budget because a lot of it was spent for the kind of development assistance that is normally now considered as part of economic management, right? So if you go through this fund, you have a host of other sub-funds for humanitarian aid, for economic management, for security assistance, for law enforcement, etc., etc. And between 2001 to 2021, the US paid around $146 billion to Afghanistan. And that is more or less, by the end of the former republic, that was about 7 times the GDP of Afghanistan. It was quite a hefty amount that went into the country, right? And Afghanistan became the largest recipient of US foreign aid between right about in 2008 when it overtook Iraq, up until 2020. In 2021, it was Ukraine that received the highest amount of aid. But between 2008 to 2020, Afghanistan was the largest recipient of US foreign aid. And this was quite unusual because Afghanistan was the amount of ODA that went into Afghanistan during this period was abnormally really high. Also partly because there was an ongoing war in the country. There was an insurgency by the Taliban militant group, in addition to a host of other militant groups against the government that was put in place. And a lot of the money that went into Afghanistan was directly or indirectly also part of this securitization project as well, right? And more the funds that were given by the US to Afghanistan were concentrated on creating the security environment, right? So if you go back to the initial state building design, you have the formal institutions, the informal institutions. Now you have the element of insecurity that comes into play. So all of this, the effort is meant to create the right environment for private sector activities to take hold. Still, the thinking is the same. Still, the approach is the same. Based on my research in 2018, I spoke with advisors at the presidential palace in Afghanistan, the High Economic Council. There were no alternative policy, economic policy that was being considered. So we were still quite adamant to implement this pro-market policy in Afghanistan, despite all the hurdles and despite the huge dependency on official development assistance. There is another sort of a drawback in terms of the development assistance, official development assistance, which in many ways affected the Afghan government's ability to also at least achieve the formal mandate that it was given in order to secure independent revenue through taxes, right? So ODA that's given to Afghanistan or countries like Afghanistan, a high percentage of that is tied aid. So tied aid means that if say United States provides aid to Afghanistan, And the first rank of contractors should be Americans that contract an aid-funded project, then subcontracts it to either to other Americans or to Afghans, right? So the first rank of contractors would pay taxes to the U.S. government and not to the Afghan government, right? And another hurdle, another obstacle for the Afghan government in order to increase its taxes was that all the companies that were in any way linked to the NATO-led mission in Afghanistan were exempted from paying taxes, were exempted from paying customs and tariffs. This continued despite the Afghan government's objection. And so in many ways, the ODA-dependent fiscal regime contained elements within itself that prevented the Afghan government to even achieve a tax-based revenue sort of self-reliance, right? The contradiction that I mentioned earlier in regards to the creation of a parallel bureaucracy as a result of ODA dependency was manifested in a lot of monitoring agencies, a lot of monitoring boards that were created in order to supervise and guide and direct the Afghan government on how to implement aid projects, right? Aid-funded projects. One of the most important ones was Afghanistan's Joint Control and Monitoring Board that was established in 2006. This was composed of 28 members. As you can see, it included different kinds of actors who were engaged in, as I mentioned, monitoring the implementation of Afghanistan Compact. The Afghanistan Compact was a turning point in Afghanistan's post-2001 state building project. It contained a host of promises by the Afghan government and guarantees by the international partners to pay for the Afghan government its fiscal needs, but in return for implementing reforms. And this board was supposed to monitor the implementation of Afghanistan Compact. So you have this parallel monitoring board, including different countries towards which the Afghan government is answerable, rather than being in communication and in interaction with the Afghan people, right? So normally in fiscal history, if you see governments or tax states have come about, or fiscal states have come about through a long process of negotiation between the sovereign, the monarch, or present-day presidents or governments, with prominent sections in the population who have the capital and the means to fund the state, right? So the state becomes answerable to social groups. And through that process, you have representation that gets built into the state design. You have a host of byproducts, institutional byproducts that develop and evolve through a long period of history. And a fiscal contract is established between the state and society. This was totally circumvented in Afghanistan's case because the state, being dependent on ODA, became more and more engaged with negotiating with its international partners, with donor countries, with these monitoring bodies, so that the bargain between state and society was undermined in this important way. And there were these other trust funds that were established right towards the end of 2001, early 2002, especially one prominent one, Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, that was established in May 2002, and was put under the direction of the World Bank. And other trust funds were established. So these trust funds were basically holding places where money was sent by different countries, by donor countries, and these organizations like UNDP, NATO, and Asian Development Bank and the World Bank were meant to monitor how this money was allocated and report back to the donor countries regarding its outcome. So in many ways, you had this parallel set of organizations that were running which were running what is normally part of the official mandate of any government, especially its Ministry of Finance. By the late 2010s and early 2000, by the late 2010s, and you see the configuration that was put in place, leading towards an amorphous authority. Not only the state system does not lead towards a centralized power, but you have a host of other organizations that are involved in the task of providing public services, both in the center and in the provinces. You have more directly the provincial reconstruction teams that were military units, international military units, who were providing normal public services in different provinces. You had close to 2,000 NGOs and international NGOs, about 60 international donors, and 47 force contributing countries that were drawn into this state building design in Afghanistan. And what I claim to be the case was that this contradiction, this fiscal dependency of the state, was a strong contributor towards the relevance of these external agents to be involved in the task of governance, which normally is performed by a country's government. There was more and more, as Lam and Sean argue, a non-Westphalian order. There were negotiations between the mandates of both military and civilian authorities, domestic and foreign authorities, regarding which areas they controlled. This boundary kept getting negotiated, and there was this confusion regarding who held power both in the center and in the provinces. So, to conclude my lecture, what came about as a result of the state design in Afghanistan during 2001 to 2021 in Afghanistan, which might be the case in other cases, in other post-war cases, which I need to expand my research to include other cases in order to see whether this has been a recurring practice. In Afghanistan's case, what we see that the contradiction led to a state that was meant to create the right set of institutions, provide public services, and work towards its fiscal independence. But at the same time, this process, this interregnum, led to dependency on ODA. Normally in history, and especially in 20th century history of nation-state evolution, we have seen that states have been, contrary to this way of thinking, contrary to what was practiced in Afghanistan, been more involved in economic resource allocation. So we are going back to the classical case regarding state intervention and non-intervention. So even in post-war states like Afghanistan, I would claim that if the thinking regarding state intervention in the economy changes towards a more involved participation of the state in the fiscal system, then parts of the contradiction that a third revenue regime leads to might be addressed. I know I've run through a lot of information, and I invite you. I'm sorry that I just jumped into the lecture right after the timing confusion. But if you have questions, I'd be more than happy to answer, and I would direct you to read the paper to get a more sort of rich picture.
If you get the newsletter, you can the link to the paper is in the newsletter. Lutfi, your comments, you'll have to shorten them.
Sorry,
How long do
sorry
I
if I
have?
rambled on.
No problem. Do I have 10 minutes or more than 10 minutes?
No, or you have less than 10 minutes. You have about 5 or 6 or something like that. Let's get going.
Easy job. So great to see another paper published on Afghanistan. Thank you for the hard work and congratulations
Look,
to
there's a
Rafi.
problem with your mic. There's a kind of echo.
Uh,
I don't understand. Okay.
Better now?
Yeah, this is better. Yeah.
Okay. So I said timely paper and fantastic job that ARI has supported this paper, and I enjoyed reading it. I, in fact, started reading this way before I was contacted to be a discussant. So when you emailed, I was glad. To be honest, I had a couple of things to run through, but I'm going to shorten all of that. So economic management is one of the discussions in post-war or post-intervention societies. Other things, other discussions being on the security and order, for example, a central versus decentralized state, or on the role of aid or international institutions, or whether it's a local versus liberal kind of approach. Local meaning local ownership of things, where liberal meaning things like rule of law, freedom, democracy, and the Western values that we know. So all of these are discussions that have to be made, and an answer have to be provided when you have this kind of post-war moment that Afghanistan also had in 2001. So the central question, I think, on the economic management domain is the degree of states' involvement, and I think which Rafi's paper also contributes and very, very nicely wraps it up and makes an argument, is this question of the degree of state control in the market and in the economy and the resource allocation. And this is where Rafi's paper is so great, where he comes in and makes this novel contribution. So I'm going to say 3 positive things and 3 things that could be improved. And hopefully I'll do that very quickly. So I think it provides the double reading of the thinking in early 2021 in Afghanistan, and that goes through the topology of state function in the World Bank and other institutions that were heavily involved in Afghanistan after the post-war, after the 2001 intervention in the post-war moment. So I think it provides a great overview and understanding, and kind of refreshes what was the thinking, what was the dominant thing that was going on in that early 2000. And the final thing is that it has this novel exploration of deferred revenue regime. It contributes to this discussion that how a rentier state kind of rises. And generally we have this in most countries that have an international intervention, right? So he follows that logic of how a deferred revenue regime is kind of running through the DNA of this state building or state design in post-2001 Afghanistan. So great read. I really enjoyed it. I think the 3 areas that I would say that the paper probably needs more discussion. One is on the baseline assumption. I think the paper makes an assumption that the World Bank and all these other institutions that got involved in Afghanistan assumes a clean slate. But the more you look into it, it does not really assume a clean slate. There is a whole host of interactions and dynamics that are going on. So I think this is actually a much more in-depth discussion on the baseline, right? So when you intervene, what is the baseline in the host country or recipient country that you're starting with? So examples of Taiwan, Vietnam, Germany, and then Afghanistan, Syria, etc., etc. Sudan comes to mind. So you're talking about what is the baseline that you're beginning with. So the paper begins with a clean slate baseline where it says there's nothing else going on, so let's have all the pro-market policies expanded. I think the second bit that the paper probably should explore a little bit more or expand is, which I kind of thought is telling half a story, is on the pro-market policy. It doesn't really expand what those pro-market policies are and doesn't go beyond that topology of functions from the World Bank. I think when the World Bank comes to Afghanistan in 2001 and then all the way to 2020, it evolves and goes through all sorts of curves and variations, to just pick an example. So is the case with the IMF and ADB and all other institutions. So it's not a coherent strategy to adopt pro-market policies and push at all costs, which seems to be the argument. The last thing is the security variable. I think the paper does not delve a great deal or doesn't pay its dues to the security argument. I think one last thing to say on that for me is to ask a question. Suppose Afghanistan of 20 years, so 2001 all the way to 2020, as it happened without the security problems that it had. So take the insecurity out of the equation. Would still we have the same deferred revenue issue? Or would the state or the markets be able to start generating taxes and then pay its dues? Or become some sort of self-reliant, if you like? So I think the paper doesn't delve much into that, but I guess it's an academic paper. Obviously, you answer a very specific question and you have to follow that line of thought, so you're very limited and you have only a limited number of words. But it's a great read. I loved reading it, and the fact that I'm working on a similar topic, it was very, very beneficial for me. I think I kept it to 7 minutes. We can't hear you, Budan. You're on mute.
Thank you. Both of you have done an excellent job of presenting a paper on time, and all of the main points were made. I invite people to ask questions and comments. I have a couple. This is a period I'm now looking at, and I'm simply amazed by hallucinatory programs in the compact where everything has to be resolved at once. As somebody who worked in Ukraine was a functioning state, or sort of, after independence, the very big question that nobody answers is, where in God's name are you going to get the capacity to do all of these things? And the World Bank, as you will notice on the things that they were going to support, never put higher education as part of it. So the state is supposed to do all of these things. Now, we know what the state looked like at the end of the Taliban. It was totally demolished, about 3 computers left in Kabul, and had about 60,000 people. Nobody is trained. One of the things that happened in Central Europe, in the first thing that happened after independence, was the establishment of institutes of public administration to train civil servants en masse. That the World Bank never did. In fact, the World Bank and ODA paid no attention to higher education. Higher education received 0.001% of ODA. So much for capacity building. It is staggeringly stupid policy. It is like beyond me how you expect people to function coming out of where you had no state, and suddenly they're supposed to understand sophisticated notions of the state without anything. Anyway, that's my rant. Are there questions and comments people want to make? So, Rafi, why don't you answer some of the points that Lutfi made? And how?
Thanks for Lutfi and Bodan for your remarks. Well, in regards to whether the actual practice of policy was informed by a clean slate thinking or not. This is something that basically takes us into the minds of policymakers. We don't have access to that kind of information, unfortunately. What we can see nonetheless is the bits and pieces of policy, the details of policy. And I've done another research on so the concrete policy reforms that were advocated or pushed by the IMF. And IMF had a much more involved role to play when it came to fiscal and monetary policy in Afghanistan. I've researched about, I've quoted around 4,700 pages of document to sort of basically trace policy making, policy advocacy from 2001 to 2021. And in there you can see the kind of thinking, the kind of approach that is reminiscent of reforms elsewhere, the kind of pushback against any kind of state intervention. You have quite detailed involvement by the IMF on the day-to-day running of the fiscal state in Afghanistan. So you had periodic meetings, periodic visits by IMF experts on the ground, coming with a package of reforms, going back with their evaluations to the IMF Board of Executives, which was quite essential because these meetings were then places where guarantees were given that the Afghan government is towing the line. So it is not diverging from the IFI or the IMF or World Bank advocated line of policy for receiving more aid. So if it deviated from the line of policy that was advocated, the Afghan government risked not receiving financial assistance from international donors, right? And more there was this push to divest from whatever remained of state involvement and resource allocation, just as a sign of clean slate thinking, right? Part of Afghanistan Compact in 2006 was to completely withdraw the state from resource allocation by 2009. A lot of government-run banks were privatized or liquidated. A lot of state-owned enterprises were liquidated. And even minor measures by the Afghan government to increase tariffs on certain items, because the government by late 2010s was more and more concerned about domestic infant industries, were being there was a pushback by the IMF and the World Bank to cancel them out, to remove them from policy. Even minor measures, there was an attempt in 2009, 2010, if I'm not mistaken, to increase tariffs on beverages or some other items in which Afghanistan had achieved some degree of self-sufficiency. IMF stepped in and consistently asked the Afghan government to reduce those tariffs, to go back to the line of policy that was put in place.
So you continue buying Pakistani Coca-Cola, right?
It's more or less that was the point, the thinking, that the entire policy came as a package and minor infringements were not tolerated. And this went on all the way to 2021. There was no visible sign of a change in policy.
Okay.
In regards to security variable, whether what we had would have looked differently if there was no insecurity, unfortunately that's a counterfactual, and the onus falls on policymakers. Right? So the onus to prove whether insecurity was taken into consideration or not falls on the policymakers who did not take that into consideration. It was a visible element in the field. Why was it, despite insecurity, the question could be put in another way, why was this policy was pushed forward? It's sort of this drive to rely on private sector activities in times of war. Afghanistan was considered a country at war by 2017 by UN and many other international organizations. So it was no longer even post-conflict. It was a country at war. Nonetheless, the thinking was that let's create the right environment for private sector activities to come about. It was just a way of thinking that at best showed a lack of seriousness and at worst showed a quite dangerous delusion by international financial institutions.
Okay, we're now 6:05. Are there any questions or comments? Questions or comments? Are there any sectors of the economy right now that follow the same line of inclusion following 2021 takeover between men and women, between Taliban and un-Taliban citizens in Afghanistan? I don't quite understand that question. Are there any sector of the economy that have men and women? I don't understand. Marjan, you're going to have to. Maybe you understand it.
Unfortunately, I don't understand if Marjan could clarify what they mean by the same line of inclusion.
Anyway, while that's being straightened out, are there any questions? Okay. So I think we can probably wrap this up.
There's Palvasha, I think, who has raised.
Okay, please.
Palvasha Ahmad say.
Okay. Let's do. Can you ask the question? I'm having a problem here. Is there?
Okay, so Marjan has clarified what they mean by inclusion. Well, to put it bluntly, the Taliban regime in many ways relies on the capacity that was created, the human capacity that was put in place and evolved during the 2001 to 2021 period. Let's not forget that during this period in history, Afghanistan experienced a heavy amount of financial and civilian tension from the international world, from international partners, mainly owing to the attention that the United States gave to the country. But not only that, but in many ways, the human capacity also hugely benefited from this attention, and there was a emerging group of bureaucrats that ran the day-to-day business of the government, especially in the Ministry of Finance. And when the Taliban came, replacing that group of bureaucrats right away was not achievable, considering that the Taliban movement had stayed away from the task of governance even before in the 1990s when they were in government. Their approach to governance was, let's say, unconventional. And if they managed to change the leadership, administrative leadership in some departments, such as the World Bank, the lower rank officials were kept to run the government. And in that sense, this could have been an inevitability rather than an official policy by the government, by the Taliban regime towards inclusion. It was they were obligated to do that.
Well, first of all, they kicked out every single woman that was in the civil service. There's an article that's going to be forthcoming that talks about the Taliban civil service. They kicked out everybody in the upper positions, and they have genuine problems now that they have to run the economy. There is Palwasha. Ahmadzai, you have a question to ask? Your hand is up.
Yeah. Okay. So I just wrote my question as well. Like, thank you for the presentation and very honest remarks. Like, I agree with a lot because I also worked in the government sector, and it's usually what I experience in the public sector. So you mentioned a lot of things like centralized government, parallel bureaucracy, and state dependency to foreign funding, and also all these. So many things are mentioned here, but I was just my remark was that if it would have been good if it was discussed in more detail, because when you were explaining things, you provided further background information about it. Maybe it's provided in the paper, but I don't know. When you were discussing it, you were providing further details about it. And in the presentation, it looked like it was oversimplified perspective and everything. And for example, I wanted to know further about, like you pointed out, but I wanted to know further that was a central in your last 2 or 3 presentations that that centralized government was the this governance intentional design to accommodate international funding institution to have authority over providing or designing public services or managing the funds? Do you think that it was one of the reasons? And also, like, I would further like to know about that. Usually, for example, for centralized government or parallel bureaucracy or governance or stuff like that, like who are the stakeholders, what were their roles, and what are the implications, and what do we other researchers need to understand and study about it? Like what is the overall background literature or empirical aspect of these issues that you mentioned here? Like you.
Basha, this is 6 lectures that we would have to do to answer that question.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry then.
But no, but I think that these are the issues. Just want to say that these are the issues that we are trying to research within ARI, and some of these, I think some interesting papers are going to come out.
That's good.
There's a paper that was done on the Taliban budget. Have a look at our newsletter and get hold of that thing. So please, Rafi, you try to answer this question.
Thanks, Palos. I have a motto: no presentation is a good presentation. I really have to summarize a lot of things in a short space, and a lot of important details. The fine grains of the debate gets lost in a rushed discourse. So I would suggest reading the paper to go through some of the objections that you raised, and not to be neglectful. I'm sure that there are many things that I've not paid attention to in my research, because well, as Lutfi mentioned before, a paper is only capable to contain a certain amount of, yes, 8,000 words. Many of the things that I discussed before about centralized government, for instance, as an important aspect of the contradiction, that was another angle to the debate. We have centralized government, a highly hierarchical system, in parallel to a pro-market economy, right? So we have the push to create that a highly centralized government administration, state administration, and the push for requiring that administration to not get involved in resource allocation. That was another line of argument that I had to cut down. I had to sort of go through a painful process of summarizing the argument in many ways. I am working on another paper regarding administrative state in Afghanistan during this period. But obviously the background information on all these debates is part of a larger literature on development policy, on post-conflict reconstruction. And my research is mainly directed towards that, using Afghanistan's case.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting talk. I think you outlined a very interesting framework of the big problem that was there. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to be fleshed out, but that's why we continue to do research. Lutfi, thank you very much for your comments. And audience participants, thank you very much for your patience. And the next lecture, which will be at the end of this month, we will do the timing right. I thank you for your forbearance. Good luck to you. Thank you, Rafi. Thank you, Lutfi. That was really very, very good. Very interesting. Take care.
Thank you, Roland.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.